At breakfast, Eric sat at the kitchen table, his eyes half-focused on the news scrolling across his laptop screen. It was a quiet, almost still morning, with nothing but the soft hum of the coffee maker filling the silence. He could hear the slight rustling as Laura placed her plate down across from him, but he barely looked up, still absorbed in the latest headlines. Laura, however, was not looking at her plate. She was looking straight at him, with an intensity that he failed to notice until she spoke. "Eric, I want a divorce." The words were blunt, clear, echoing with a finality that would shake most people. But Eric didn't flinch. He closed his laptop calmly, letting the silence stretch between them as he took a careful sip of his coffee, his expression barely shifting. There was a faint lift of his eyebrow, but beyond that, he showed little reaction. "All right, if that's what you want." Laura's eyes widened, her calm mask faltering for a brief moment. She had expected anything really. Anger, hurt, questions. She wanted to see him react, to give her a reason to feel validated in her choice, maybe even some release from her own guilt. But instead, she was met with a cool, unbreakable wall. Eric was staring at her, his face unreadable. Eric knew himself too well to give in to any burst of emotion. He was a man who prided himself on restraint, a quality that had guided him throughout his life. In his late 40s, Eric was tall, with silver beginning to show in his thick hair, and a face that carried the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to keep his emotions under control. Years of working as an investment banker had instilled in him a polished composure that few could break. He was meticulous, a man who relied on reason, on structure, and his even demeanor was his anchor. Marriage, to him, had always been a partnership, a bond grounded in respect and mutual support. Love had its place, but it was the commitment that mattered. He'd married Laura 15 years ago, hoping they shared that same steady foundation. But recently, he had sensed a shift. The late nights, the guarded phone calls, the faint smell of cologne that didn't belong to him, little clues had built up, unmissable to someone as observant as Eric. He hadn't confronted her, he never did. Instead, he chose to wait, to let the truth reveal itself. So now, as he looked across the table at his wife, his mind remained clear. Laura was staring at him, likely waiting for something, an outburst, or maybe a hint of sadness. But all Eric did was take another sip of his coffee, feeling only a strange calm wash over him. Laura felt a strange, almost hollow sense of shock as she watched Eric's calm reaction. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had been preparing for this moment, imagining it in 100 different ways. She'd pictured him standing up in anger, hurt filling his eyes, his voice rising in the quiet kitchen. She wanted him to feel anything that would give weight to the decision she'd finally forced herself to make. But there he was, staring at her with that same measured expression he used when reviewing bank statements. She felt her own control slipping. "Did you hear me, Eric?" she demanded, her voice tightening. "I said I want a divorce." "Yes, I heard you, Laura," he replied, setting his cup down. "You've made yourself perfectly clear." The flatness in his tone cut into her, sharper than any argument could have. She wanted him to fight, to argue, to make her feel that their marriage had meant something. Instead, he just sat there, an unmoving pillar, watching her with mild indifference. She was about to say something, to try and break that wall he had so carefully built, but Eric simply stood up. "If you've made up your mind, then there's not much more to discuss, is there?" he said, his words as measured as if they were talking about weekend plans. He straightened his laptop and coffee cup, each gesture precise and controlled, before giving her a brief, almost dismissive nod. "You know where to find me if you have anything else to say." He left her there, a flicker of emotion never once crossing his face. Once he was out of the kitchen, Eric closed the door to his study and exhaled slowly. He felt none of the anger or betrayal she might have hoped for. That wasn't how he worked. He knew that this was the end, that any hope of a real partnership with Laura had vanished. She'd made her choice, and now he would make his. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop, already mentally planning his next moves. Eric knew how these things worked. He had watched plenty of colleagues stumble, getting entangled in bitter divorces that left them financially ruined and emotionally spent. That would not be him. He clicked open their joint accounts, calmly moving through the steps to transfer the bulk of the funds into accounts solely in his name. The mortgage payments and utilities were moved to separate accounts he controlled. Any automatic transfers linked to Laura's personal expenses were disabled. Eric's fingers hovered over the credit card tab. He felt the faintest hint of satisfaction as he systematically canceled each of their joint cards, watching the notification emails roll and confirming each action. It was almost laughable, the thought that Laura might still be oblivious to the fact that he'd been expecting this. He had anticipated the betrayal long before she'd ever spoken the words. People thought that keeping a marriage together was a matter of love, but Eric knew better. He had been loyal, consistent, willing to commit to the steady life they had built together. Yet somewhere along the way, Laura had chosen to want something else, something beyond their comfortable, stable life. Eric set up an appointment with his attorney for the following afternoon. He knew Laura would probably assume she'd get half of everything, but Eric had plans in motion long before that. She would find that he had been as meticulous in preparing for her departure as he had been in managing their finances. He leaned back, eyes scanning his meticulously organized files, a small smile playing at his lips. Emotions were fleeting, unreliable. He'd never seen the sense in letting them dictate his actions. This was his strength, the ability to act, without letting anger or disappointment cloud his judgment. Laura wanted a reaction, but he would give her none. Instead, he would show her what real control looked like. After talking to Eric, Laura went straight to meet her lover. Laura drove across town, her mind a churning mess of emotions. The smooth leather steering wheel felt oddly comforting in her hands, grounding her as she pulled into the parking garage of the high-rise where Trevor lived. She was supposed to feel relief, but Eric's reaction had left her feeling strangely hollow. It was as if he'd been expecting this, like he'd already moved on from her, leaving her without even the satisfaction of seeing him hurt. She had expected anything but that icy indifference. The way he'd barely looked at her, as if she were some minor nuisance, left her feeling small, inconsequential. When she reached Trevor's apartment door, she didn't even knock. She opened it with the key he'd given her months ago. He was waiting in the living room, dressed casually, a look of concern mixed with excitement on his face. "Laura," he said, crossing the room to embrace her. "How did it go?" She let him wrap his arms around her, pressing her face into his shoulder. Trevor's warmth soothed her, but it didn't fill the strange void she felt. She didn't answer right away, and he pulled back, looking down at her face. "I told him," she said at last, her voice a little hollow. "I told him I wanted a divorce." Trevor's eyes lit up, his hands tightening slightly on her shoulders. "Finally," he said softly. "How did he take it?" She shook her head, a faint bitterness creeping into her expression. He was cold, barely blinked. It was like he didn't care. He just looked at me like I was a stranger. Laura searched his face, feeling a swell of hope rise within her. That was what she wanted, a new beginning, free from the quiet, measured life she'd shared with Eric. She wanted excitement, romance, the thrill of being seen and cherished. "And you're sure this is what you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course I'm sure," he said, a confident smile crossing his face. "I wouldn't have waited all this time if I wasn't. I see us traveling, maybe even getting a place by the beach. A place that's ours, you know? Not a life someone else planned for us." She nodded, feeling a glimmer of happiness at the thought. But something in her mind pulled her back to Eric, to the life they'd built together. The years they'd spent, the careful way he'd planned their future. Eric had always been steady, providing, structured. He'd never been the romantic type, but he'd always made sure she was comfortable, that she never wanted for anything. Yet she knew, deep down, that Eric's practical, reliable love wasn't what she wanted anymore. She was drawn to Trevor's spontaneity, to his light-hearted vision of a life lived to its fullest. In her mind, Eric had come to represent a cage, beautifully crafted, but a cage all the same. She couldn't imagine returning to him now after tasting this new kind of freedom. "I don't want to go back to that life," she said quietly, almost as if convincing herself. "It's time for something different. Something just for me." Trevor nodded, his hand warm against her cheek as he studied her face. "You'll never have to go back, Laura. I promise." He smiled down at her, his eyes lighting up with a hint of mischief. "I'm not the type to just let you go back to him, you know." She laughed, a little genuinely this time, letting some of the tension finally ease from her shoulders. In that moment, as she looked up at Trevor, Laura felt the first hint of excitement about what was coming. She imagined the trips they would take, the late nights filled with laughter and intimacy. But beneath it all, an uneasy feeling lingered. She wondered if, somehow, she'd underestimated Eric. She tried to push the thought away, convinced that her future with Trevor would be worth the uncertainty, worth whatever lay ahead. Before you find out what happens next, please subscribe to the channel. A few hours after his conversation with Laura, Eric arrived at the job, his face impassive as he navigated the halls, nodding in acknowledgement at the occasional familiar face. Though his mind was racing with everything he'd just set in motion that morning, he wouldn't let anyone see even a crack in his composure. He made his way to the corner office of his longtime colleague, Walter, who was the closest thing he had to a confidant at work. Walter was in his 60s, a tall, lean man with thick, graying hair and a habit of adjusting his glasses as he read through any document, no matter how trivial. He had a calm, fatherly air about him, with deep-set eyes that seemed to know things before anyone else. The years had weathered his face, but his steady voice and thoughtful words had earned him quiet respect around the office. "Eric, my friend, you look like you've had a rough morning," Walter said, gesturing for him to sit in the leather chair opposite his desk. "What's on your mind?" Eric took a deep breath, pausing only briefly before saying, "Laura wants a divorce. Told me over breakfast. No warning, no real reason. I thought maybe she'd try to explain her desire rationally." Walter nodded slowly, his face softening with sympathy but not surprise. "I see," he said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the desk, his hands folded in front of him. "It's a blow, no doubt. But you seem remarkably composed considering." Eric let out a dry laugh. "I'm not sure how else I'm supposed to feel. It's not like I didn't see it coming. She's been distant for months. But even so, I thought maybe." He trailed off, his voice fading as he looked down, unwilling to finish the thought. Walter nodded again, understanding without needing to pry. "It's always the way with these things," he said quietly. "They tend to hit harder than we expect, even when we've been bracing for impact." He leaned back, adjusting his glasses as he chose his words carefully. "But listen, Eric, you know I've been through this myself. Twice, in fact." Eric managed a small smile. He'd heard pieces of Walter's complicated marital history over the years, but had never thought he'd find himself in the same boat. "I'll tell you what I've learned," Walter continued, his voice low but firm. "Don't let this woman's choices drag you down. She's made her decision, whatever her reasons may be. You, on the other hand, have a life to keep building, goals to achieve. Don't waste a single emotion on her that could be better spent on yourself." Eric looked at Walter, appreciating the calm wisdom in his friend's words. "Easier said than done." Walter smiled knowingly. "Sure, it's easier said than done. But you've got the upper hand here, Eric. You've got the time, the resources, the will to move on with your life. I've watched you build this career with discipline most men don't have." He paused, making sure Eric was really listening. "Don't let bitterness eat into that. Focus on what's next. Self-development, new challenges, things that make you stronger." Walter leaned back, studying Eric thoughtfully. "Look at it this way. This is your moment to redefine your life, even if it's not on the terms you'd planned." Eric absorbed Walter's words, feeling his shoulders relax slightly. His friend was right. Whatever disappointment and betrayal he felt didn't have to derail him, he could choose to channel it into something better. He nodded slowly. "Thanks, Walter," he said, his voice steadier now. "I needed that." Walter smiled, reaching across the desk to clasp Eric's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "Anytime, my friend. Don't hesitate to lean on those around you. You don't have to go through this alone." Later that afternoon, Eric met with his lawyer, Michael, in a sleek office downtown. Michael was a sharp, efficient man in his 40s, with an eye for detail and a no-nonsense approach that Eric appreciated. "So, Eric, let's walk through the strategy here," Michael began, laying out a series of documents in front of him. "First and foremost, the house. If you want to keep it, and I'm assuming you do, there are a few steps we need to take to prevent Laura from contesting that." Eric nodded, his eyes steady on Michael. "I want to keep the house. She's the one who wants out. She can find somewhere else to live." "Good," Michael replied, tapping his pen thoughtfully on the edge of the desk. "Here's what we'll do. I suggest you stay put, file a restraining clause if necessary, and ensure she has no grounds to argue that she has any claim to it. If she's planning on leaving, the courts will likely see it as abandonment. This could work in your favor." Eric leaned forward, feeling the first flicker of confidence since the morning. "And what about the accounts?" he asked, his voice calm, though his mind was alert. "Wise move closing those," Michael replied approvingly. "If she tries to access anything joint now, she'll find herself out of luck. With those assets secure, we'll focus on the legal positioning. I'd also advise that we maintain a record of her behavior. Should things become contentious, any evidence of her infidelity or financial misconduct will strengthen your position. It's all about giving you the leverage to negotiate from strength." Eric felt a calm settle over him as he took in Michael's straightforward approach. There was no room for doubt here, no reason to second-guess himself. He could see the path ahead more clearly, with Michael's help guiding the way. "I want this to be as smooth as possible," Eric said quietly, though the steel in his voice was unmistakable. "I don't need drama. I just need my life back." Michael gave him a nod of approval, leaning forward with a serious expression. "Then stick to the plan. Don't let her get under your skin, no matter what she tries. The best outcome here is one where you walk away intact, maybe even better off." He leaned back, folding his hands. "And Eric, look at this divorce as an opportunity. Reinvent yourself, your goals, your vision for the future. You're in control here." Over the next few days, Laura found herself living a strange, unexpected kind of freedom at Trevor's apartment. She told herself it was convenient. After all, his place was closer to work, and he was more than happy to have her there. She basked in the thrill of a fresh start, of mornings spent drinking coffee with him and late nights filled with laughter and whispered plans for the future. But there were moments, brief as they were, when an odd feeling would catch her off guard, a sense of finality that lingered at the edges of her mind. That feeling turned into a reality on a Wednesday morning at work. Laura was going through her usual emails when a young intern, looking nervous, approached her desk. Ms. Reynolds," he stammered, holding out a thick envelope. "This came for you." "I think it's from a law office." The word struck her like a slap. Laura took the envelope, feeling her face heat up as she glanced around and noticed a few of her colleagues throwing curious glances her way. Her fingers trembled slightly as she slid the envelope open, revealing the stark, unmistakable words, "Divorce proceedings initiated." Her stomach dropped. She'd wanted a divorce, yes, but she hadn't expected Eric to act so fast, to deliver these papers so publicly. The humiliation washed over her, sharp and stinging. She forced herself to look composed, carefully folding the papers back into the envelope, but her mind was a storm of emotions, anger, frustration, and a bitterness she hadn't anticipated. The way he'd done this, in front of everyone, felt like a calculated move. He knew how much she hated to be embarrassed, how she prized her reputation at work. She felt exposed, like he'd stripped away her control and forced her into a vulnerable spotlight. If he wants to play it that way, she thought, fine. Her anger simmered beneath her professional mask, hardening into something sharper, something that demanded release. That evening, Laura drove to Eric's house, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her mind a haze of rage. She fumed, her mind replaying the humiliation she felt at the office, the shock of those divorce papers arriving so coldly, without a word from Eric. She felt as though he'd left her no choice but to respond in kind. Inside the house, she stalked to the master bedroom, where Eric's closet stood like a quiet, unassuming monument to his order and control. She felt a twisted satisfaction bubbling up as she yanked open the closet doors and pulled out his neatly arranged clothes. One by one, she ripped down the shirts he'd folded so meticulously, hurling them onto the floor in a growing pile. She grabbed one of his expensive button-downs, white and spotless. The rage within her flared as she dropped it to the floor, grinding her heel into it, twisting the fabric against the hard surface. She pulled out more shirts, dragging them through the dust and dirt by the door. This is what he deserves, she thought, breathing heavily. She felt the sting of his indifference in every yank, every tear. It was a release, but it wasn't enough. She found herself clawing at his favorite jacket, ripping at the seams and feeling the satisfaction of fabric giving way under her hands. She spotted an old shirt of his from a work retreat, something she knew he liked. Without a second thought, she grabbed it and tossed it over the edge of the garbage can, wiping grime onto it in deliberate, messy streaks. She felt a sick sense of triumph, like she was reclaiming a small piece of her dignity. Yet as she continued, the satisfaction she felt began to twist into something darker, something hollow. Each act of destruction felt increasingly futile, her anger mounting without release. There was no relief, only a gnawing, bitter frustration that the damage she was doing couldn't reach him, couldn't make him feel anything. She collapsed into an exhausted heap, staring around at the mess. Then she took a breath and stood up. Looking at the scattered things, she took another look at Eric's clothes and spat on them. After this act of vandalism, she packed some of her belongings into a suitcase. Several times she said out loud that she hated Eric. Then when she got nervous, she even said she wanted to burn down the house. After this emotional storm, she headed for the exit. She knocked over a table and a few chairs along the way. But Eric, it turned out, was far from oblivious. He had anticipated Laura's rage and had taken steps to make sure it didn't go unnoticed. Days earlier, he discreetly installed cameras in key rooms, half expecting her to lash out in some way. He knew Laura too well. He understood the way her anger often eclipsed her judgment. So, when he received the footage that evening, he watched it calmly, his face impassive as he witnessed her rampage from the detached view of the security cameras. In the dim light of his study, Eric replayed the footage, each scene confirming his decision to prepare for the worst. The recording showed her clawing through his things, her face twisted with anger, her hands destroying what little she could. He took mental notes as she desecrated his clothes, evidence of her lack of restraint, of the volatility that he'd come to expect. A small, satisfied smile crossed his face as he closed the laptop, the evidence now secured. The footage was more than just a record of her behavior. It was ammunition, something he could present in court if she tried to come after his assets, his home, his stability. He saw this as a necessary step, a precaution that would not only protect him, but also help him make his case against her. He could already picture the way this footage would play in the courtroom, the way it would undermine any claims she might make against him. This wasn't just a defense, it was a weapon, one that he would wield with calm, calculated precision. For the first time since Laura had announced her intentions to leave, Eric felt fully in control. He had transformed her rage into his advantage, her recklessness into his leverage. And as he prepared for the road ahead, he knew he had no need for revenge or bitterness. Logic and preparation would serve him far better. The divorce proceedings began with a steady, deliberate pace, each stage moving with the precision of a plan Eric had crafted to perfection. With the evidence of Laura's outburst in hand, he leveraged every advantage. His attorney, Michael, presented the recordings to the court, along with financial records and other assets Eric had secured well in advance. It was as if every move Laura had made, Every misstep in her anger had become a tool Eric wielded with calm precision. Laura's attempt to argue for a share of the house was quickly dismissed when Eric's attorney brought up the video footage of her vandalizing his property. The recordings painted a clear picture of her instability, making any claims she had against him seem weak and baseless. As for the financial assets, Michael had ensured that Eric's meticulous transfers were airtight, leaving Laura little to contest. Piece by piece, Eric watched as her case crumbled, her confidence eroding as she faced the consequences of her actions. The final court date came swiftly, ending with an unequivocal ruling in Eric's favor. He retained the house, his accounts remained untouched, and Laura was left to face the reality of her decisions. That evening, Eric sat alone in his house, now free of any reminders of his former life with Laura. The silence felt different, not hollow but peaceful, a space he could fill with whatever he chose. He felt certain now that his life was his own, and he intended to make the most of it. 3 months later, on an ordinary Saturday morning, Eric stopped by his favorite coffee shop, a place he'd come to appreciate in his new routine. As he waited for his order, he spotted a familiar face standing by the window, Trevor. The recognition was mutual. Trevor glanced up, surprise flickering across his face before he nodded in acknowledgement. "Eric," he said, trying to muster a polite smile. "Didn't expect to see you here." Likewise, Eric replied evenly, his face impassive as he looked Trevor over. The man seemed thinner, a little more worn around the edges, as if carrying a strain he hadn't expected. Trevor cleared his throat, a slight awkwardness creeping into his expression. "Look, I know things between you and Laura. Well, let's just say they weren't ideal. Not sure if you heard, but Laura and we're still seeing each other." Eric raised an eyebrow, his expression one of mild curiosity. "I see," he said simply, allowing a hint of sarcasm to seep into his voice. Trevor shifted uncomfortably, glancing away before continuing. "I don't know if you're interested, but Laura's pregnant," he said, his voice trailing off as he looked back at Eric. There was a hint of hesitation, as if he wasn't quite sure how Eric would react. Eric's face remained carefully neutral, but inwardly, he felt an undeniable wave of irony. Laura, the woman who had tried so hard to escape the confines of their marriage for a life of freedom, now finding herself tethered to Trevor with a child on the way. It was almost poetic. "Congratulations, then," Eric said, his voice betraying a touch of amusement. "I hope you're prepared for her unique temperament." The corners of his mouth twitched slightly, though he kept his expression composed. Trevor let out a weary sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. Let's just say she's been difficult. The mood swings, the hysterics, they're exhausting. I didn't realize how much work it would be." Eric inclined his head, nodding with a feigned sympathy that concealed his inward satisfaction. "Yes, she does have a way of expressing herself," he said dryly, taking a sip of his coffee. He didn't feel any anger or jealousy. Instead, he felt detached, as though Laura's troubles had become part of someone else's life entirely. Trevor looked at him, a mixture of frustration and resignation in his eyes. "Honestly, sometimes I wonder if I got in over my head," he admitted. "But she's pregnant, and I suppose there's no turning back now." Eric's smile was faint but unmistakable. He felt no bitterness, only the satisfaction of knowing that Laura's chaos was no longer his burden. She had left him for a world she thought would be more exciting, only to find herself ensnared in it in a way she hadn't foreseen. And here he was, standing outside of it all, untouched and unbothered. "Well, Trevor," he said with a polite nod, "good luck. I hope it all works out for you." Trevor's face fell slightly, as though he had been hoping for some camaraderie, some shared understanding. But Eric was already turning away, his coffee in hand, his thoughts focused forward on a life that was finally his to build, free of the past and all its baggage. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.